Welcome to another Nina and a Renee. Hello, guys. Can you hear us okay?
Yes.
Amazing. Nina, there's another Nina on the call that has the same name as you. That's never happened for us in a webinar before.
Oh, I don't know why it's showing me as Nina. My name is very different. I'm
Oh,
Shweta.
oh, okay.
Yeah,
That would have been too weird, wouldn't it?
Well, there you go.
Yeah.
Welcome, Shredder. I don't know if you can change your name, but feel free to do that if you like.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining
I'm,
us.
of course.
Hi, Renee. Welcome.
Hello, everyone. I'm going to stay camera off if that's okay.
Absolutely.
Sure.
Whatever you prefer, no problem. Amazing. I'm just going to give everyone a minute and then we'll get started. There is a lot of people who are going to be accessing the recording because they're in a different time zone, so that's fine as well. There is also an opportunity to ask questions throughout. If we're a smaller group, we can probably ask them out loud. If it's a little bit more of a larger group, sort of like 8 to 10 or more, then putting them into the chat, and feel free as we go through, we can cover them off throughout the presentation, as well as cover some more off at the end as well. So please feel free to ask questions. I'll give everyone one more minute to get started. Most people usually trying to dial in. Logging on to Zoom sometimes takes a bit of time. So once they're in,
It does, doesn't it? I always find that.
especially with Zoom, it seems like it's slowed down a little bit.
Yeah, yeah.
Less investment in Zoom, I think. Maybe that's probably
Yeah.
a challenge. Amazing. Welcome to Rob and Minami. Welcome. We are going to get started in just 1 minute. Thanks for joining us. Curious, just whilst we wait for a couple of other people to join, where are you dialing in from? If you don't mind just putting into the chat, I'm curious to know whereabouts you are, whether you're here in Oz or whether you're somewhere more abroad. And welcome to our new joiners. Welcome to Paul. And a few others have joined as well. Perfect. Oh, wow, Utah. Very nice. Thanks, Sweta, for joining us. Not sure what the time is there, but appreciate you joining.
Thank you. It's 8 p.m. here.
8 p.m. Okay, not too bad. Not too bad.
Yeah. Yes.
Perfect. All right. Well, I'll let my team continue to let people in, and we'll get started. And as I mentioned earlier, if you've got any questions at any time, please put them into the chat. I'm more than happy to answer as we go, so you don't have to forget the question. And also, we'll have some time for questions at the end. So I want this to be really collaborative, as always, with these meetups, so that we can actually make sure you leave with value as well. So yeah, fire away if you've got questions in the chat, and we'll make sure we get them covered as best as possible. Okay, getting started. So the reason we decided to do the Scaling Your PMO was really because over the last sort of personally for 20 years for me, but 8 years in terms of working in business and working with a lot of different companies, what we typically find is that PMOs tend to maybe sometimes start off small, and particularly if they're in a company where you're introducing a PMO for the first time. For example, we recently did an engagement with a FMCG, and they had never had a PMO before. They got to a point where they've introduced one, and now they're thinking about how they would scale this function of the PMO. And we're going to talk about the different types of scaling. I'm not sure for those on the line who have heard about the concept of scaling horizontally versus vertically. So I'm going to cover what that is as well. We're also going to cover why we would need to scale a PMO. Sometimes the reasons to do so maybe outweigh the risks of doing so. So we'll cover some of that as well. We'll also talk about assessing your PMO's readiness to scale. So sometimes we might want to do something. For example, we want to scale our PMO because we running the PMO, particularly if we're the person running the PMO as the manager, might think it's the right time to scale, but it might not be the right time to scale. So we'll cover off sort of what are the things to look out for to help assess whether you're ready to scale. Then we're going to talk about capabilities. So a lot of the time when I talk about capabilities, people assume it's the capability of an individual. In the context of today and what we talk about when we think about PMOs, it's more about the capabilities of your PMO function and the ability to do certain things, whether that's resource management or pipeline management, etc. And we'll go through some examples of this, so don't be worried that we're going through a lot of this fast now. And then strategies for scaling. So I'll cover off some strategies, and then I'm going to take you through a couple of examples of a horizontal scale and a vertical scale, and sort of the experience of doing that in a medium-sized business and a large business. And then we'll talk about mitigating risks and challenges and an opportunity to work together as well. As I said, put some questions in the chat and we'll happily cover them off as we go. Okay, so moving forward, just get my slides up. Okay, so I'm curious, from thinking about the perspective of scaling your PMO, for those that are on the line, I'm curious, is anyone currently in this position of scaling or thinking about scaling? Or are you more just observing and thinking about it just to gather information for future reference? So scaling or not scaling? I'm curious, because then I can tailor the content a little bit more. If you want to just chuck that into the chat, that would be amazing. So I can tailor the conversation a little bit more for you as well. So when we're thinking about scaling our PMO, and regardless of whether we are the project PMO, a program PMO, a portfolio PMO, or any other type of project management office, there is often a number of different reasons why we would want to scale. One of the most common reasons for scaling is usually because the volume of projects that are under governance of the PMO function is usually outweighing what we've got in terms of capability at that point in time. As an example, recently with an engagement, we had a company that never had a PMO before. They introduced a PMO. They thought they had about 20 large projects that were over $1 million each. And what they ended up finding is after a number of assessments and reviews that they actually completed, they realized they had 96 projects. So 96 projects compared to what they thought was 20. And of course, of the 96 projects, there was quite a significant number of those that were really small, but still the need to scale was very evident for them as well. So thinking about the reasons to scale is really important to consider where your organization is at the time. So increasing project numbers is most common, plus complexity. When you are a small to medium business, you usually would have lots of smaller projects. Some of them could be as small as $10,000 and sometimes up to $100,000. But when a medium-sized business is looking to scale to a big size, they usually do a large volume of projects under the banner of a transformation project. And what that typically means is they might be looking to bring in a CRM system, they might be looking to bring in a HRIS system, and then the complexity of the projects that they're managing becomes very evident. And this is where another reason to start scaling the function that you had at that time. There's also a need to scale when you realize that, particularly in organizations that start their PMOs, for example, they often start in IT, because IT tends to have a lot of the projects. And then they realize, wow, we're actually standardizing the way we do projects, we've standardized our governance, and we've done a number of different things that have been really well received by the organization. And then what you find is other functions within the organization start to want to leverage some of those best practices that you've introduced in your PMO. So that's another point in time where we start to think about scaling. And then the third reason is often around the need for additional strategic oversight and alignment. So many PMOs that I've worked with and spoken to and that we have engaged with in the PMO leader community have PMOs that do not sit at the C level, the executive level of an organization. When they don't sit at that level, and typically they're not an enterprise PMO, that means they don't usually have that strategic oversight in terms of linking to organizational strategic objectives and goals. When a company decides that they want to scale, sometimes it's because they realize the value that the PMO is providing, and therefore they want to elevate that PMO to an enterprise level function. One company in the medium-sized financial services space, they ended up demerging from a much larger company. When they demerged, they were a smaller business initially, but as they scaled, they ended up having 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 people. And then that's when they realized we actually need to elevate our PMO out of IT up to an enterprise level. And so that's another reason why you would often find scaling becomes a necessity. As I go through a couple more examples, I'm curious for anyone that is in the position of scaling now or has recently scaled a PMO, I'd love to know what was the reason that the scaling of the PMO was decided. So if you could put that into the chat, I'd be really curious to know why you scaled your PMO. The other piece around scaling and the need for scaling comes from the necessity to be more adaptive and responsive. So for an example, with the rise of Agile, now I know Agile's been around for 25 years plus, but in a lot of some of the more larger, let's say the banks, for example, in the last sort of 5 to 7 years, and still currently, they decided to go on this huge wave of introducing Agile ways of working. Different flavors, different Agile-based methods, different consultancies went in to help them, all sorts of different approaches. But one of the things that was really evident in terms of that introduction of Agile ways of working for these organizations was initially they started downsizing and eliminating PMOs because the concept of PMO doesn't sit anywhere didn't sit anywhere in any Agile-based methods. Now, they've started reverting back and introducing them again, and that's evident from what you'll see in terms of job posts online for these banks. But what they've realized is they actually need the capabilities of a project management office to actually help them to be more adaptive and be more responsive. And so having the ability to bring in a function like a PMO, and some of them are reintroducing it, has made all the difference for them. And it's helped them now to streamline the way that they're delivering projects and products by bringing in some of those skills and capabilities that the typical project management office has, even if it is under a different name or an umbrella. So I'm just looking at some of the comments there in terms of so work and complexity, yeah, absolutely. In terms of standardization and building consistency, absolutely. Usually what happens is, and as I said, PMOs usually start in IT. That's kind of the most logical place I've seen it start. But when they're doing really well in terms of projects and the IT manager starts talking to their colleagues in sales or HR or finance or any other function, there's a little bit of envy there. And they actually want to leverage the good work that's being done. And that's where the PMO's reputation starts to increase and become a lot more present. So it definitely is an opportunity to look at and understand the reasons why you intend to scale. Let me know if there's any questions and I'll try to answer them as we go as well. Okay, so this one's really interesting. So when thinking about coming into this meetup today, my team and I were talking about not only why we need to scale, but how we scale. Now, when we think about scaling, it is not just a simple matter of adding some resources or just picking up more projects. You actually need to have a think about whether you want to scale your PMO vertically or you're going to scale horizontally. I will preface this by saying sometimes we don't have a choice as PMO managers. Sometimes it's decided for us. But if we have an opportunity to be involved in that conversation, then of course we'll make the right decision for us. So has anyone heard of the concept of scaling vertically or scaling horizontally when it comes to PMO? Yes or no? Curious to see how many people have come across that concept. That way I'll know how much to deep dive into it. Yes, no in the chat? No, yes, no. Okay, yes. Couple of yeses, couple of no's. Okay, perfect. So it seems like a 50-50 so far. So thinking about vertically, so this is where we look at elevating the PMO from the perspective of elevating up, and usually it's up to an enterprise level. I mentioned in the example earlier that the organizations typically do that when they realize that the capabilities of this project management office has actually been well received across their organization, and they decide that they actually need a lot more strategic oversight of initiatives that are undertaken in the company. One client recently who I mentioned had 20 projects and then realized they had 96 after a little bit of a mini audit. The managing director of this company in a management meeting was talking about the pipeline of projects, and it was being presented on screen. And of the 96 projects, there was a project on there that she had absolutely no idea what that project was. Now, being a smaller organization, the management team were across all of the initiatives and what they were. But in that room of 10 people, 10 managers, and only one manager was missing from that day, nobody knew what a particular project was, and they had all these unique names, so it made it hard as well. Now, that's not a good thing. As an executive of a company and being one myself, I typically would want to know what's going on in the organization. And this example just showed them that they didn't have the visibility necessary. So in this example, this particular managing director decided we actually need to scale up this PMO that initially started under IT, and we need to bring it up to the enterprise level because she wanted visibility of actually what is going on in the organization and how they were going to spend their investments. By doing it vertically, it gives you an opportunity to influence a lot more than you typically would influence, because you're starting to talk about working with the C-level executives. And that is where you start getting the leadership buy-in and support that almost every survey out there about PMOs consistently talks about being something that is missing. So if you are given the opportunity to rise your PMO up the line from an initial functional PMO up to multiple levels, up to an enterprise level, it will give you that influencing power to really drive the type of standardization and improvement of capabilities across the enterprise. And I can tell you, although very difficult to do sometimes, it is extremely rewarding when you get it done right. But there are lots of definitely challenges and risks of doing that. And what you'll find is there will also be resistance. Now, I mentioned the example of a IT manager having colleagues in other departments being really envious and wanting to sort of leverage the project management skill sets, but it also can go the other way. You can also find that other functions who run projects, maybe not as maturely, will not want to align to this new enterprise level PMO. And we'll cover off some things to do to help you navigate those challenges in just a moment. And then the other thing in terms of horizontally, this is where you scale, but you're scaling horizontally. And what this basically refers to is where you might be running a PMO in a particular function or even a portfolio. And a portfolio, for those that are not clear, is a collection of programs and projects. You might find that you do such a good job in a particular space around a portfolio or a department, and then you get asked to actually bring in another portfolio or to cross multiple departments. A good example of that was in banking. We were running a global PMO at the time for one program. After the success of the program, the manager that was running that program became the department head. She became the general manager. And what that meant is she was then given a number of portfolios to manage underneath her department. So she naturally wanted to horizontally scale and take the best practices and learnings from the program that was successful. And then we overlaid a lot of that into the other portfolios. So from one large program, we ended up having about 7 programs running, and that enabled us to diversify the projects and programs within the portfolio. It enabled us to reduce the cost because we'd still leverage the same number of resources because we were able to standardize and provide a lot more flexibility in the way that they leverage resources. But it also enabled knowledge sharing. So they didn't have to start from scratch. So when we think about horizontal, so broadening your horizon, some of the challenges, though, are the coordination aspect and the strategic allocation of resources. When you start to horizontally scale and you bring in other portfolios or programs or departments, you have to then sort of fight over resourcing because they might have had a function of PMO or a PMO resource or some sort of governance resource. And then you have to figure out whether you bring them into the overarching function, whether there's a change into the way that their role works, and also they have to adjust their way of working if they already have something in place. So I think it really does become challenging when thinking about that scale. So as I said, vertically, horizontally, they're both very different, and there's pros and cons for both. And I'll definitely cover off some additional examples to scale, unless there's any specific questions at the moment. Can see one's
Just
popped
one
in.
question there for Tima. So a good question. At some point, as an organisation scales PMO, does it happen that one ends up scaling both horizontally and vertically?
Yeah, it's a good question. Look, I think it has happened. I wouldn't say I see it as frequently as you know you would probably think it happens. But just to give you an example, I've seen a function of PMO start again in IT, which is the most commonplace, and then I've seen the PMO go from IT into the digital portfolio. Believe it or not, having a digital function and IT function, so IT sort of day to day, and then a digital transformation initiatives, products, etc. I've seen the PMO scale that way. In this particular company, when they realized the value that PMO can bring, they ended up merging those PMO functions and actually then enterprise scaling, so scaling vertically. So it does happen. It's just probably not as often, I think. It's usually a company makes a decision to do one or the other.
I think as well, just to add to your comments there, I was just thinking, given our experience and like the number of times that we've done this, I think that if you've got a choice to not do both at the same time, it's kind of good to focus on, like in my mind, I always think of the vertical as kind of raising your influence. And there's a really kind of like distinct approach and change strategy around that, where the horizontal, to me, it means kind of like uplifting the capability. And again, the way that we'd approach that and the change strategy around that is really different. So sometimes if you try and do both at the same time, like usually PMOs, we've got, you know, restricted budgets and restriction in people. So it can be, like from a change perspective, it can, like we've found, it can get quite complicated. Yeah.
100%. And that actually probably links into Paul's question about typically whether we see vertical, horizontal. So we more often will see horizontal. And the reason for that is if you're scaling vertically, you need to get buy-in from pretty much all the department heads, whether you're a 100-person business or you're a 10,000-person business. When doing it, for example, in a large banking organization, we have to get the buy-in of different general managers to actually come on the journey. And if they are running something of a semblance of PMO in their space, they might be really happy with the way that they're doing things and not really willing to come on board that concept of vertical scaling. But it's more horizontal scaling, I would say, is what I typically see. But you know, vertically will happen when an organization has maybe been running PMOs or things like PMOs for a while and they're not getting the traction they need, like that example in FMCG earlier. You're very welcome. Okay, so now we know that there's different ways of doing it. Now let's think about what the sort of concept of a healthy ecosystem is for PMO. Look, thinking about this particular aspect, I've mentioned multiple times, if you look at any piece of research or any study anywhere, you'll find that they talk about leadership buy-in, leadership buy-in, leadership buy-in. And the truth is, everyone that's not like an executive leader, like a C-level leader, like your GMs or your CEOs, etc., will shout to the rooftops about, we need leadership buy-in. But I can tell you now that the leaders up there are not thinking about PMO. They just don't. Because in the scheme of things, they've got other things that they're worrying about. And so that's why the PMO in a lot of companies often gets sidelined. And that was evident with some of our biggest banks in Australia recently in the last however many years. When they did their all agile ways of working, they had one bank, for example, had dozens and dozens and dozens of PMOs. I know that because myself, Lucy, others were running them, but they just decided that that wasn't that important and they actually eliminated that function altogether because, you know, in Agile, they can govern themselves. Well, that was what they used. And I can tell you that it's not working and they're absolutely reverting back now. So the point is leadership and sponsorship is necessary in order for you to scale. In the horizontal example I gave before, we had a general manager who was more senior than a number of the other managers within those portfolios, and she gave the backing to enable us to scale horizontally. So she was bought into the process and bought into the concept. That meant we were able to do it. So it was a proactive approach to scaling. When we look at the FMCG example I gave, the leader at the top decided that it was going to happen because she was not getting the visibility she needed, and there was too much risks associated with their $10 million portfolio of projects. And so absolutely cannot scale without leadership support. That's a given. Then the other side of it is what to look out for, that I consider the healthy indicators, and then also the other side of it, which are the watch points. So when we're thinking about scaling, you need to strike the balance between the aspects of horizontal and vertical. And what I mean by that is, if you're in a larger organization, you may have no choice but to scale horizontally because there's already an enterprise PMO. But in many organizations, the enterprise PMO's focus point is usually around the investment slate, so the company's money, and less about standardization, particularly in large businesses. So they will leave you alone in most instances. So what you want to do is you want to make sure that whilst you're scaling horizontally, you're at the very minimum understanding the minimum requirements to adopt or adapt to the minimum governance requirements of the enterprise PMO. For example, how you roll up financials or how you roll up the visibility of projects, which is probably using tools. So there's an aspect where horizontal exists in parallel with vertical, but the vertical part is something that you're not able to do because there is an existing function already in there. The other part of it that's a positive thing to think about is having the ability to be more engaged and in tune with an existing enterprise function enables you to be more proactive and ensuring your projects and programs and portfolios, along with your management team, more aligned and deeply aligned with strategic objectives and initiatives. So the more you are, if you have a vision of scaling your PMO and you think it's possible in your organization, in a medium-sized organization, more likely than an enterprise one, which probably already has a function, is the more you can get involved in the strategic oversight of your projects, programs, portfolios, the more value it becomes, and the more likely your MD or your C-level manager says, oh, I actually want that, but I want that across the company. And that's what we typically see. Some of the watch points to think about is you also need to stop and pause and think about what kind of culture that you are running, or that's running in your organization rather, because as mentioned earlier by Lucy, without good change management, which enables us to adapt and make these changes and communicate and help bring people on that journey, like any other project, it will not work. So one of the things to think about is what sort of culture you have in your organization. In a local council example, we found a very challenging culture between delivery and governance, and they were always at heads with each other. So there is no point trying to scale a PMO where the delivery teams are absolutely at ends with the governance teams. It just won't work. It'll be a waste of time and it will be really frustrating. Whereas in the FMCG example I gave, they were all in a position of understanding the objectives of this company was to scale and to, you know, do a number of other things more broadly that enabled them to work together. And so working together meant they had the right culture and they were willing to test and learn and make mistakes. And we absolutely made mistakes. And that was part of the experience. And then the final piece around sort of watch points is, do you have a continuous improvement strategy? So how do you continuously improve what you're doing, assessing it, and how often are you going to do that? I would be asking you to think about that upfront and having that conversation with whoever's involved in your scaling plan, which we'll talk to in a second, and make sure that you are adjusting as you go, because like any project, things change and you need to adjust with the times. So if you're able to have a continuous assessment of where you are today and a strategy to move forward, plus the right culture, then you're in a good position to scale. Any questions? Okay, perfect. We'll keep moving. Okay, so when thinking about your PMO's readiness to scale, what we wanted to share here is these are a number of the key core capabilities that AMO, our business, uses in not just in PMOs, but we do use them for PMOs as well. And what you'll see here is we've got a number of parent capabilities, being the top line items in bold, so planning and design, we call it a parent, and then the items underneath are called children. So the parent capability and the children's sub capabilities. And these are absolutely not individuals or people capabilities. They are business capabilities within the function or functions within the PMO. Now, you'll see here there's 10 core items, and those each have their own sub-capabilities underneath them. If I was assessing a PMO's readiness to scale, what I would be looking at is, at minimum, the items marked in red. When looking at all of the dozens and dozens of project management offices that personally I've worked in and those that the team at AMO supported, they're the ones that are the most important that we've seen generate the best return on the investment. You can't do everything, and you won't be able to do all those items in red if you're a one person, but you might be able to start by prioritizing those with your organization. And so these are just part of our capability framework, but you can see demand and prioritization, the first one, is single-handedly the most important one out of every engagement personally we've run in the last 8 years. That is the one that companies have the absolute most challenges with. So that is usually, if you're going to do nothing else, it's having visibility of all of the projects. And that's the first thing I would be looking at doing within any PMO I take over, or starting to understand what is the projects that exist in an organization and just simply collating them at the very minimum. Having an understanding of that then gives you the information you need to be able to then define what you're going to do next in terms of building out capabilities or bringing in resources or improving processes. So don't start with anything else but that. And then you'll see there's a couple of other red items. In the third column, standards and methodology, you'll see we've highlighted frameworks and standards, but we haven't highlighted methodologies. The reason for that is methodologies is usually something that delivery teams have already decided how they're going to use them or what they're going to use, particularly where there's no PMO present. So whether they're using an agile-based method, whether they're using Pinbock or Prince2, or whatever it might be, that is something that they will decide. And in the first phase of your PMO, you do not want to start telling and dictating to delivery how to change what they're doing when you've got all of those other items in red to focus on. So instead, having some sort of guardrails, which are part of the frameworks and standards, will enable you to get the outcomes you need, but not be overwhelming delivery with all these different changes and then getting them offsite and then not being able to be successful with anything else. I'm curious, is there anything on this list that is not marked in red that you think is more important, that you would suggest is more important than the items in red? Curious, anyone got an opinion on that? If not, my presumption is that you agree with me, and that's great. Okay. All right, so we'll keep moving. So now, strategies for scaling. So when we think about scaling, we've talked about the types of scaling. One of the first things to do is understand where you are today and making sure that you have clear objectives for why you want to scale. Now, unfortunately, we've worked with some PMO managers who want to build their own, conglomerate of PMOs, and they want to take over the company, and it's all about them. It's all about the who. It's all about me. I'm the person. I've got this big ego, and I want to run things. Then they end up building all these like cottage industry style functions. So we don't want that. So let's start by assessing the current state of where you are and understanding what the clear objectives are for your scaling or for your PMO in general. When we do that, it enables us to be really clear with anyone we're engaging with, to communicate, to bring them on that change management journey, to actually understand why we are doing what we're doing. Because without connecting with those people and meeting them where they are and asking them for feedback at the very beginning of any of these changes, you won't get the buy-in and it just won't change. I can guarantee you that. So once you've assessed the current state and you've defined the clear objectives, you need to think about what will be your scaling strategy. And I'm going to give you 2 examples, and I'm going to take you through 2 examples. So example 1 is incremental scaling. So this is where we gradually will expand the PMO services and capabilities, and you may do it in an iterative way. And some PMOs that are working in a more agile environment will typically be doing that in the same way that projects are run in agile-based methods. They'll sort of take on some of the sort of principles of agile and actually do that in the same way. You know, they might have a visual Kanban wall, and they'll be tracking their initiatives, and they'll be bringing stakeholders on the journey, and they'll be incrementally scaling. And sometimes they're doing it silently, and slowly they're building up. The alternative of that is transformative scaling. So this is where there's an absolute rapid restructuring and expansion of the PMO. And there's different times you would use one or the other, and it really comes down to a number of things, but the main one is what your culture is like within your organization. If you are having a tough time culturally, and it's a challenging environment, and there's lots of sort of egos and a lot of different teams that are really precious around how they run things and the way that they work, you're probably better off focusing on an incremental scale, especially if you don't have the top level leadership buy-in. If you have top level leadership buy-in, and you actually do have the sort of the right culture to experiment and to do those change and to really collectively agree to improve as a business, then you might be better off doing a transformative scaling approach. So I'll give you 2 examples in a moment and explain how these 2 work in reality. But the last thing I wanted to cover off on the scaling is some things to consider in addition to scaling plan. You obviously want to leverage existing technology. So one thing that a lot of PMOs do that is a mistake is they go and rush out and buy a PPM tool because they think the PPM tool is going to solve their problems, when they haven't even defined what their processes are, their frameworks for how they're going to be working. Don't do that. It's not the right first step. The other thing to think about is when you're doing your scaling plan, you need to understand what your organizational roadmap is. If your organization is looking at selling off parts of its business in 3 years, and you see that in the strategy, well, I'm probably going to be hesitating how I scale my PMO because I might be wasting money. But if your organization, like one of our clients, was preparing for an IPO, an international public offering, then of course they're going to scale because they need to meet a lot of regulatory compliance, and doing that with a PMO really makes sense. So think about how you align to what your organization is to meet them where they are. Think about how you can enhance. You can also start by enhancing project management and governance incrementally, and then go to a significant transformation agenda. The way and the reason I would do that is to prove the concept and prove that I'm actually improving things within an organization. And then once they see that improving, I'll move to actually doing a larger, more transformative approach. The other thing I would also do when scaling a PMO is think about your resource capacity. If you're a one-person show, it's going to be really difficult for you to scale too much. So you're definitely thinking about that previous slide, only be able to focus on certain things. You also want to think about how you would promote knowledge sharing. If you are scaling, you don't want to spend time and money, either internally or on consultants, creating processes and tools and templates that already exist in pockets around the company. So promote knowledge sharing, bring people together, and actually find out what exists in your organization. And then the last one is think about the governance structures that exist today, and then what you would need to modify moving forward when you scale. In the banking example I was giving, the global PMO function that I had set up at the time with a team of 2.5 people, we realized very quickly that for this large program of work, we were leveraging insights and information from 13 other countries. What that meant was we had to adopt our PMO and build it to align to how New Zealand ran their projects and programs, how Singapore ran their projects and programs, how Vietnam ran their projects and programs, how Australia was running their projects and programs. I would not have gotten all of those teams to change everything that they did and the way they worked to appease the program head office, which was in Melbourne. It just wouldn't have worked. So instead, what I focused on was understanding the minimum governance requirements, at an enterprise level, going back to how we manage our investment as a company. So the money, how's the money managed? Understanding that was a rule that was across the board. And then we started delving deeper into a few of the other types of governance requirements. How do we onboard resources in Australia versus Singapore? Because the program had 100 people on it. So that was a guidance we had to define and understand. when thinking about methodologies, while New Zealand was using agile-based methodologies like Scrum, whereas in Melbourne, they were heavily using PMBOK. So again, I can't expect New Zealand to change the way they're working. So instead, what we did was we defined governance stage gate, points in time that regardless of how you delivered to get there, we all met at that point in time. So as we sort of started to do all of these things, we realized that the governance structures and the processes became a lot clearer. And when you're starting to scale, you really want to define those things up front and do it with the people that are going to be leveraging and using the processes rather than doing it in isolation. Does that make sense in terms of scaling? Is there anything anyone would add or any questions on scaling before I deep dive into a couple of case studies? Okay, seems like we're good. All right, we'll keep moving then. Okay, so I'm going to take you through, oh, perfect, thank you. Mindset and process, absolutely. And look, everybody says mindset. If I go on LinkedIn right now, I'll see 15 posts about mindset and everyone talks about it, but nobody actually knows what that means. And I think that mindset is really, really about the culture that you have within the organization and how we come to work. And I think that there is some teams that are in the not in the fixed mindset that are really open to changing, and you'll start to see that because of how they respond to other changes within an organization. You know, you really will know whether your culture's, you know, in the right position to change. Where it's difficult is if you go into a company new, or you've just started a new role, or it's your first 90 days, it might be harder to ascertain that. So definitely have lots of conversations with people to try to get a sense. And if you think that you don't have the right mindset and culture in your organization, then I recommend trying the incremental scaling as opposed to the transformative. So I'm going to take you through two examples. I'm not going to read this. I'm just going to give you a sort of synopsis of it. And then I'm going to take you through some risks and challenges and how to mitigate them. So I talk about incremental approach. So in this example here, we're talking about a medium-sized business. Now, I'm not sure how for those on the line, whether you are in a large business or a medium business. So I thought I'll give you an example for medium and I'll give you an example for large. Now, in this medium-sized business in financial services, it wasn't a bank, it was a financial services company. What they had undergone was a demerger from a very large business that did this aspect of financials, but they also did lots of other things. And they decided to actually split off and create its own standalone business. And this standalone business does credit cards and business loans and things like that. Now, when they decided to demerge, they had to figure out how they would take all of the project management office, delivery, governance, all of those elements, if they were going to take them from the global company, which has significant a number of people in it. I don't know if it's 50,000 or more, I think, and figure out, do we take all of this and then bring it into this medium-sized business? And the answer is no. The reason for that is if you take what you do in a large multinational corporate 50,000 person business and you try to put that in, at the time it was 1,000 people business, it's not going to succeed. And I can tell you that the challenges with that are very vast and varied, but they're very common, and they are the same across companies we see when they try to take big business and put it into medium. So what they decided to do is build an enterprise change office. That was their equivalent of an EPMO. And in this particular example, we decided that it would be prudent of us, whilst the transformation program was going to demerge the two businesses, to look at what aspects of those capabilities I showed before that we could incrementally scale. And so we focused on a number of things. The first thing we observed is that there was in this new business, within the sort of 2 years of the transformation program, that there was a lot of dysfunctional PMOs. Really specifically, there was PMOs by 3 different consultancies all running in the same company. Now, I can tell you as a consultant, everyone brings in their own methods and tools and processes, and they were all very disconnected. There was confusion around what the PMO would do and not do. And there was also significant overuse of tools, where they had everything from your Teams tools, your Jira tools, your Confluence, you had Miros, they had everything you can think of that exists out there. They were all using it in different ways. And there was a lot of disconnect because there was no central view. So with the transformation program that was going on at the time, which was worth a lot of money. It was already a high pressure environment. Culturally, as an organization, they were not in a position to take a transformative approach to their PMO. So instead, we had to take a incremental scaling approach. We developed a plan. We got the heads of departments to come in and buy into that process. And then what we did is we proactively and transparently collaborated with them to build out the incremental capabilities, piece by piece by piece. 1 year after the transformation program concluded, and that was successful, they ended up making the ECO, the Enterprise Change Office, continue to evolve it, but they took a little bit more of a transformative approach at that point by really ramping up, and they had a vertical scaling approach where all projects then came in through the ECO. And so that was the approach we took, and that was what worked from an incremental. Does anyone have any questions about the incremental approach to scaling? Okay, I know it takes a bit of time to type in, so feel free and I'll come back to it if anything pops in. So let's go to an example for transformative approach. So again, thinking about this time an ePMO with a transformative approach. So this was a transportation industry business, and they are a large business. And as this organization was moving from sort of medium to large, they realized the need to centralize, standardize, and bring a lot of clarity and oversight to all of the projects that were running in the company. Now, in this company, before they became a large business, what they found was they actually were having projects running in human resources, in finance, in sales, and all of them were running, but they didn't have project management skills in those areas. So in operational departments, they usually wear the hat of a project manager, but in many instances, not all, they don't actually have the experience. And so you find that projects go forever and ever and ever. One recent example to give you was I was working with a high growth startup, and they were in the renewable energy space. And when working with the chemistry team and the pharmacists in this particular business, they were listing out all their projects. And what we were going to do is collate them all together and start to overlay OKRs. Now, when I started receiving the projects lists from them, they had purchasing an office chair listed as a project. Now, that's not a project, but just that example there just shows you that sometimes in operational departments, they're experts in what they do. They're not experts in project management. And so in this particular organization, they were really well aware of that. And in order to scale, they really, really needed to transform the way that they worked. And they did that very successfully. And in this particular example, because they were a medium-sized business going to large, we were able to develop a scaling plan, bring people on that journey, and actually develop out the fundamental frameworks, governance, process, and tools within that 8-week period. As an example, the question here is, what in 8 weeks, how is that possible? Well, because we started with a clean slate, there wasn't an existing function. You can start with a clean slate and accelerate the way that you deliver and add additional resources on top to be able to do that faster. The 8 weeks was the build aspect, but it was the 3, 4, 5 months later of embedding and activation that was the change management element to bring people on that journey. So the question, Renee, is 8 weeks is sort of to develop the scaling plan, build out the processes, frameworks, tools, methods, etc. And then actually in terms of embedding, it happened in the months after, where the months after it was actually the head of the ePMO and his team that started doing the embedding because they had to own the solution. So hopefully that answers your question.
And Fatima, the question as well, just on the previous case study, I know that was, like a significant engagement, but can you recall the timeframe kind of start to end?
Yeah, absolutely. So overall, that was about 1.5 to 2 years.
Yeah.
And that was the first, I'd say 6 to 12 months was really about incremental, because we weren't going to alienate people with a transformative approach. And then the following year, we took a harder approach because we'd proven the concepts of what we were trying to do. And we had buy-in from audit and sales and risks and ops and all of those other departments. So it was about, that long. And that's relevant for a large business. And when you look at CMMI models and like improving maturity, they say it takes on average 18 to 24 months to go up a level of maturity. So it kind of coincides with that. Okay, we are nearing closely. So I'm just going to take you to mitigating risks and challenges. Now, this isn't an exhaustive list, but it is the ones that I would ask you to look out for. And some suggested strategies and options to move these risks and make them less risky. So the 4 biggest ones: lack of clarity in roles and responsibilities. Now, this is very prominent when you start to make changes to your function, you scale, where you actually don't communicate the changes to roles and positions. And this is the only time I'm going to talk about the who, but everything else I've spoken about, PMO is not about the who, it's about the what and the how. So when you make changes to your function, if you're one person or you're 15, like in the large business example, there was 15 in the EPMO, you need to make sure it's really clear around the changes you're making and make sure everyone's clear on accountability associated with that. In order to do that, you need to make sure it's not just having a generic RACI, and for those that don't know what a RACI stands for, we can put it in the chat, but it's about making sure that everybody is clear on what is changing. Processes are changing. What about how those processes are managed and governed and used? Do we have project managers now in the new approach? Are they responsible for uploading their data into their PPM tools? Or is the PMO still doing that? And sometimes they do. So these are the sorts of things we need to think about. We also need to make sure that we have communication and feedback loops. Too many PMOs go and come up with solutions and ideas and things that they think are amazing. And I know because I did that in the past. And then we go and spend all this time building this amazing PowerPoint deck, and then nobody uses it. Now, if I don't communicate and introduce feedback loops to bring people on that journey and get their feedback, just like running a business without customer feedback, you don't know if you're on the right track. It's the same within an organization. And also then the cadence. So if you're changing the way that you're working, whether you're scaling vertically or horizontally, I would want to make sure that we're updating and changing our cadence as well. So if you're in an organization that has to work with an enterprise PMO, they are very unlikely going to change the cadence that they are working with. So you need to still allocate the time to understand that and link to it. Whereas if you're in a business where you are the EPMO, then you might change the cadence of, for example, in that previous case study, we actually had to work with finance and ask them to change the way that they were doing their reporting cycles. Now, I know that sounds really crazy, but because this was a brand new company, they were in the midst of actually trying to set their processes. And because projects made up basically $500 million of the company's budgets, they were actually more willing to listen. And there was a lot of reasons why they made those changes. Then there's the integration of systems and processes. A lot of companies, like that first example, there was big business processes, and then there was a new business. How do you integrate the two? So that's a really big, challenging one. That's why you need to do a scaling plan so that you can actually proactively define this upfront so you don't get caught out in the middle of the program. Then you want to test and validate those and assess if they're being effective. Now, if you don't regularly test and validate those, you'll end up doing what one of our other clients did, where they introduced a project portfolio management tool and they spent a lot of money on it. And then they realized that they didn't accommodate the agile-based methods. And as a result, they had to spend $2 million to reset the whole framework. And that was because they didn't bring the PMO people into the room to actually provide input on that process. So don't do that. Make sure you bring in input and be adaptable as well. Resource allocation was another one that I talked about before. So this is really important because in order to be able to make the changes happen, you need to have adequate resourcing. But that doesn't mean you need to hire 10 people tomorrow. Even as a one-person band, you will be able to make incremental changes, but you'll just have to target your focus and be laser focused on a few capabilities at a time. And then also when you're assessing and setting up your scaling plan, you want to make sure that you eliminate any unnecessary process as well. And then finally, we talked about culture. When I talk about training and support, it's not going out and sending everyone on project management 101 training. That's not always the solution. Training and support could be very simply training in-house around how you're using certain tools. One company, for example, has spent a lot of money bringing in Microsoft Power BI, but nobody knows how to use it. So why don't the people that know how to use it well actually bring that into the company and actually bring the rest of the company on board and teach them how to use those tools. So there's some of the risks and challenges. If there's any other risks and challenges that come to mind for those that have mentioned that they are in the middle of scaling, please put it into the chat. Otherwise, I'm going to close out with a couple of opportunities for those that are interested. And if there's any other questions, put them in the chat and I'll close out with answering those. So if you're in a position, and this is the only part of it where I will offer you an opportunity to work together, is we absolutely can be involved in helping you. I'm very happy myself and Lucy and my team to actually coach you in the process of either uplifting or building out a PMO if it's brand new, and actually provide you tools, templates, resources, coaching calls before, during, and after, and actually spend, if you're Melbourne-based, it'll be in person, and for those online, it'll be a virtual coaching cohort over 2 half days in your time zone. So there is 5 spots left for the May cohort. If you'd like to be part of that and want more information, just say yes in the chat, and then Nina and my team will reach out to you to send you more information or connect with me on LinkedIn. And if you are not doing that and you're not in a position where you're setting up a PMO, but you are just interested in actually improving your team, your function, or your business, you might want some additional support, like, you know, someone to help you do a project health check or a governance check, or you might want us to do a scaling planning workshop with you or a risk management workshop. Those are all things we can do that are 1 or 2 days investment, which is very little considering the amount of experience and knowledge we can bring to the table to help you. So they're both available there. Otherwise, whilst we wrap up with questions or comments, Nina's going to put the link to the feedback survey. I think it's like a couple of questions, just to let me know if we're on the right track with these meetups to do them more in future. But I'd love to hear from anyone. Was there anything that specifically resonated with you today? Is there any questions or anything I didn't cover that you would love for us to cover off before we wrap up for today? Don't be shy. I'm very happy for you to ask anything. All right. I can see. Okay, perfect. Yeah, perfect. So yeah, if you could just look at that feedback, that would be amazing. We are planning on doing some additional meetups on capabilities, and we're also planning on doing one on governance, risk, and compliance. So make sure you're subscribed to that link, the first link, so that you can get notified when those events are happening, so that we can be part of that. Otherwise, if you want to connect with me as well, Renee, very happy for you to join on LinkedIn. Very happy for any of you to connect with me on LinkedIn, ask questions, email, reply to chat, however you like. I'm very glad that you enjoyed the session. Feel free to tag me on LinkedIn with what resonated for you the most. Of course, as a small business, these things take a lot of time and energy to put together, but I'm glad you got value from it. Otherwise, it looks like we are bang on time, which is really good considering we're all PMO and project managers. So on that note, thank you so much. If you've got any questions, reach out to me on LinkedIn. Very happy to chat. And thanks to my team for helping. We'll see you at the next meetup, and we'll send out the recording. Have a good day, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.